Hey guys, so I left off at the BFG. If you remember, the flesh lump eater had gotten a little bit out of hand, and luckily, if you remember, when Sophie fell to the ground, she jabbed the flesh lump eater with that brooch, and they ended up tricking him and thinking it was a poisonous snake, and that's how he ended up holding down there, and they ended up wrapping him up. And that's where we had left off with lump eater all tied up. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmoozle. When you only sleep in 1 or 2 hours a day, you sleep extra doubly deep, the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, the head of the Army said. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? All right. Now all you guys got to drive your jeepies over to me cave so I can get all of me dreams, the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the Army general said. It is the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back in the BFG's hand, so the 9 jeeps drove across the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars all loaded up, more than 5,000 in each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish up the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What have you got there? The head of the Army demanded. Curiosity's killing the rat, eh? The BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, Now we drove him back to the belly poppers, and we'll pick up them frolicsome giants. And you can see the helicopters carrying the giants across the land. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. Oh, flush bunkled, roared the flesh lump eater. Also spits wiggled, yelled the child chewer. Oh, swalloped, bellowed the bone cruncher. Ah, ghost graggled, howled the man hugger. As gungle squawked, shouted the man meat dripper. Oh, flunk gaggled, screamed the maid masher. Oh, slop goggled, squawked the gizzard gulper. Ah, crack squiggled, yowled the blood butler. Oh, hope muggled, screeched the butcher boy. The 9 carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants, the chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then the giants winced them up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing that they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off on a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giant as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking.